it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The thing from the forest changed my life for the better. Greetings, friend. I couldn't help but notice your campfire from the path. May I join you? Oh, were you telling scary stories? Well, I have a scary story of my own. Won't you indulge me? For weeks I'd fantasized of this trip, or at least since my friend Lucas invited me. My first trip away from home. I was understandably nervous, especially since this would be my first night away from the comforts of my own bed. As to be expected, my mother was her usual overly protective self, ensuring all my items were packed and sorting my clothes as well as some long-lasting food. You know, the same thing all mothers do. Lucas arrived driving his 80s Ford camper van, a beat-up old thing handed down from his brother. It was a surprise it even ran with the abuse it had seen over the years. Lucas pulled into the driveway around 7 a.m. I was already waiting outside, messing with my phone. I picked up my bag and hugged my mother goodbye and left for the van. Oddly, I got an uneasy feeling deep in the pit of my stomach, almost like I'd never see her again. The feeling gradually began to build until I buckled up in the worn-stain-covered seats of the camper van. The back of the van was filled with the rogues gallery who'd be joining us on our trip. There was Sasha, Lucas's love interest, and genuinely the closest you could ever get to evil. Jake, who was Lucas's brother, small-time junkie, and the original owner of the van. And finally Ellie, Jake's girlfriend. Personally never got invested in knowing much about her. I watched the trees go by as we drove through the country lanes, the morning sun slowly beginning to disappear behind the overhanging trees. Jake thought now would be a good time to tell the group a little horror story about the cabin we were staying at. It was a few years ago or so, when a group of teenagers went to the cabin, the same one we'll be staying at. One whole week flew by. They didn't return, so a concerned parent rang the police. For a whole month they searched, from the woods to the near mines, but with no luck. Well, until the fifth time, when they found a scrap of clothing inside a cave system. While walking deeper into the cave, they found a body. This body had been stripped of its flesh and organs, but what was left was its muscles. Odder still, the body was missing its skull, but its head was untouched and still perfectly shaped. Many natives who've lived near the woods claimed it was the great pan beast, known as a Wendigo, who had committed the deed. I scoffed loudly and voiced my opinion. This story was a load of rubbish. I began calling out many inconsistent parts of the story, and even showed a Google search with no connections to the missing people. Well, Jake sneered at me and nestled himself comfortably into his Ellie's bosom, his glare pointed directly at me with an unshakable malice. I couldn't help but crack a smile and turn to face the window. I placed my head softly on the window and slowly began to drift off. I awoke with a shudder. I felt as if the world was spinning around me. I sat upright and looked around, trying to get my bearings. It didn't take me long to notice I was sat outside the van, only now it was on its roof and completely wrecked. There was no sign of my friends, or any life for that matter. And the very notion of being alone next to the smashed wreck made me feel worse when coupled with the disorienting feeling I had. My eyes jerked all around my surroundings. There was nothing but thick, dark woods in every direction. Before I could fully take in my situation, my body began running as if it didn't want to stay next to the area of destruction I'd woken up in. It began to run deeper and deeper into the woods, following a winding path that seemed to materialize in front of me. All around me the woods felt rife with the unseen. Hundreds of wild animals in a defensive-like state, all focused on me. The unshakable notion of being watched forced my already paranoid mind into overdrive. I over-assessed every direction. From out of the seemingly darkened woods, a cabin slowly came into view. Every single one of my instincts told me to run, but I couldn't. I jerked my head around as a roar, or perhaps a cry of an animal, echoed through the woods. Something that was hungry and ready to kill to survive. My body once more began to move towards the cabin, until I was faced with the door. Twin scratch marks ran parallel up the wood, as if something had tried to get in. Well, I didn't want to know what, but it felt like whatever it was hunting me. I pushed open the door only to be consumed by a luminous white void. I felt weightless, almost floating, until my mind began to wake. And then there was nothing but a falling sensation. I awoke from my nightmarish slumber, tugging at my belt in a panic. The sensation of falling from my dream continued well after I'd opened my eyes. The van was stationary, yet my eyes continued to spin as if I was moving, leaving a sickening feeling of disorientation to wash over me. Oh, thankfully it subsided as soon as it started. Jesus, Bobby, your lazy ass slept like the whole journey. You didn't even wake up for any of the 3 pee breaks, or hell, the 25 pizza stops. Sasha's voice dug into my sleepy brain. It was fair to say she was still her usual moaning self. No surprise, really. Lucas opened the van door, and hazily everyone stepped out. Had to shield my eyes from the low sun that now crept over the tree line. God, I must have been seriously out of it. Had I really missed so much, I mused to myself. I grabbed my bag and began following Lucas down a cobbled path towards the woods. Well, the cabin lay just a short ways along in a modest open clearing. The whole walk I felt as if there were thousands of eyes trained on me, all hidden beneath the undergrowth, just staring, watching, observing us. We eventually reached the cabin's main door, albeit through the moans of Sasha. Lucas grinned a cheeky grin and told us, "Welcome to paradise." As soon as he opened the door, a freezing breeze burst past us. It felt like a warning, almost as if the very building was telling us to drop all our stuff and run for home. I personally neglected the feeling and put it down to an empty cabin that had been left unused, not to mention probably a few broken windows and holes. As everyone crammed inside, I began looking over the cabin's interior. It was old, dusty, and unlived in, very similar to one in a horror movie. I stood apprehensively in the dining room and waited for Lucas to enlighten everyone on where we'd be sleeping. "Okay, Jake, you and Ellie are opposite the kitchen. Now, Jake, don't go eating all the food in the middle of the night." Jake sneered and caught the key that Lucas had thrown. Sasha, you're with me at the end of the hall, the master bedroom." Sasha never looked up from her phone. "All right then, Bobby, you're in the alcove above the kitchen. Just climb the ladder midway down and open the hatch." I nodded, not really taking any notice. As everyone began to leave, Lucas made a snap decision, albeit a stupid one. "Hey, Jake, pass me one of your plastic bags." Well, somewhat surprised, Jake did. "All right, everyone's phone's in the bag. I'm locking them in the safe." Well, Sasha looked white and clutched her phone tightly. You could almost feel the force she gave off. "Lucas, please don't take my phone. I might need to call my mom," Sasha begged. But all that begging was futile as Lucas placed her phone with the others into the bag and then into the safe. Lucas then continued with the rules of the cabin, but my interest lay with meeting my bed. I slowly slipped out of the dining room and headed down the hallway. The ladder clung to the wall, almost invisible to the untrained eye, as it sat inside a small indent inside the wall. I pushed open the trapdoor that lay open on the roof and lifted myself upwards. The room itself was nothing more than a medium-ish platform that was missing a wall, allowing me to overlook the kitchen. Well, the drop was very sudden, straight down to the floor. However, I was in prime placement for some midnight snacking, as I could reach the cabinets. Well, I gathered some items and headed down the ladder towards the only door labelled bathroom. It looked strange having the word written over the door, but then again other cabins could be like this. I wouldn't know. I hopped into the shower and twisted the taps. I jumped in shock as a stream of sludge water smacked me full force in the face. Eventually, the water got warmer and cleaner, but in my panic, I hadn't noticed the door had been slowly opened and just as quietly shut. Nor did I notice a large shadow looming through the shower curtain. I fell back and screamed high-pitched in horror. Then Sasha laughed uncontrollably as she raked open the curtains. Well, most people would think I'm weird if I told them I showered wearing swimming trunks, but if you know the people I was with, then the notion suddenly didn't seem so weird. I shouted at Sasha to leave and threw a loofah at her. Grinning, Sasha left and I stepped out of the shower. I looked into the mirror, trying not to let my mind be filled with anger. I looked deep into my reflection and lost all awareness of the space around me. My face began to change, or distort, you could say, but that's when I was wrenched from my gaze by something being dragged by the window. I looked back into the mirror, and for a split second I could have sworn that I saw myself as a grey figure wearing a deer skull looking back at me. I slapped my face and splashed water on me before making my way back to my room, hoping that some sleep might help me. I lay down and rested my head on the mattress that was now my bed and relaxed my eyes. I was surprised I was actually still tired, but after my restless sleep, I had to say that nothing surprised me. I did, however, hope to have somewhat more pleasant dreams than before. This time, I was sat hunched over in the middle of the woods. A crimson moon hung low in the sky, barely illuminating the naked trees. A thick, smoggy mist had engulfed the area, leaving no visibility below my ankles. "Hello? Who's out there?" someone shouted, making my head twist a sharp 90 degrees. I began to run towards the voice, but I continuously stumbled. It felt like my legs were far too long for my body, and soon I found myself running on all fours. I lunged up a nearby tree and swung from branch to branch with ease, stopping only to observe my surroundings. I saw something shifting around in the undergrowth beneath me. I blinked my eyes, and my vision shifted. Everything meshed in a cold but tranquil dark blue. Underneath me stood a shimmering orange light, holding something red. Unable to understand what I was seeing, I shut my eyes and opened them again. Now my vision switched once more, showing the woods in a dark green. Well, it took me a few minutes to realize I was seeing in night vision. The orange light was now more definable. It was a person holding a flashlight. "Hello?" shouted the figure, now looking around pedantically. I began to slowly climb up a tree and use the branches to get closer and closer to the person until I hung only inches away from them. Now I was close enough to be able to identify the person. Stood still observing the area was Jake, still dressed in the clothes he'd arrived in. I blinked once more and my vision returned to normal. Slowly I dropped from the tree and straightened myself behind Jake. He was now smaller than me, significantly in fact. Hearing a slight snap, Jake turned to face me and fell over, his voice caught in his throat. Well, I couldn't look away as I lunged at defenseless Jake on the floor. I made a series of quick slashes and then removed the organs with the perfect cuts I'd just made. Unable to control myself, I began to devour the organs, feeling stronger as I did so. Once I'd finished, my gaze drifted over to a cabin that stood about 500 yards away, just stationed in an opening. Once more I broke out into a run on all fours, heading directly towards the cabin. I arrived in what seemed like record time. I slowly stuck my head close to one of the windows, observing what was inside. Lucas was snuggled up next to Sasha with the TV casting static over the both of them. I shook my head and slunk over to another window. This one was Jake and Ellie's room, although it was empty. Once again I shook my head and moved to the final window that belonged to the bathroom. I peered through the window and saw Ellie laying down in an empty bath with an empty packet of bath salts in her hand. Well, I shook my head angrily this time. I began to crawl up the cabin towards the chimney, testing to see if it was hot. Upon seeing it wasn't, I slipped down it, dropping into the dining room, making as little sound as I could. I crawled around the hall, but stopped as I heard a door open. Instinctively, I jumped to the ceiling and dug my nails deep into the wood to keep myself in place. Ellie walked out from the bathroom in a towel and a noticeable blood stream coming from her nose. I waited until she'd entered hers and Jake's room, and then I silently shifted into the kitchen. I paused and looked to the alcove that I was sleeping in. Climbing the counter and then the cupboards, I positioned myself to look at my sleeping body. Nodding my head, I slowly made 2 slits onto my sleeping head that I then licked before turning away. A crash from the kitchen woke me, and my vivid dream faded into nothingness. Rubbing my eyes, I checked my alarm clock. 3:15. The noise sounded again, but this time I knew what it was. Smashing plates. High from my alcove, I peeked over the edge, fully expecting it to be Jake looking for a midnight snack after one of his infamous chill-out sessions. As I poked my head over the edge of the platform, I watched a figure in the darkened kitchen, sat consuming food sprawled over the floor. Well, at that moment I was positive it was Jake, now deep into one of his munchy moments. I stayed silent and watched him for a while, thinking, this is the reason drugs are bad for you. I was just about to crawl back into bed when the fridge was opened and everything I'd thought was real took a back seat. As the light illuminated from the now empty fridge, the figure's entire being could be clearly seen. My body froze and my heart decided to check out with my sanity. The creature at the fridge looked grotesque, with disjointed body parts, all of which were a discolored grey. The head was what stuck out the most, though. Its entire head was covered by the skull of what I assumed was an elk. Ellie groggily walked into the kitchen, half asleep and, well, I assumed high. She made her way to get a drink and began to walk out before looking to the now stationary figure behind the fridge door. "Jake, you coming back to bed, babe?" she asked, her words slurred. I then watched in horror as the creature opened its mouth and Jake's shriveled head began to protrude from the inside. And its reply sounded identical to what Jake's voice sounded like. "Yeah, honey, I'll meet you there." Ellie walked out of the kitchen and back to her room, still completely unaware of the differences between Jake and the creature. As soon as the bedroom door clicked shut, the creature closed its mouth and shut the fridge door, straightened its body to be more human in shape. I watched as it walked to the kitchen door, but it stopped to look at where I lay, and it placed a grey finger to its lips. The creature then walked out of the kitchen, and I heard the faint click of Jake and Ellie's door go again. Well, I crawled to the furthest corner of my room and huddled myself tight and waited. I sat, unmoving. My entire being was filled with unbridled fear of this creature, and thousands of questions raced through my mind. What was it? What could it have been? What had it done to Jake? And now, to Ellie? All these feelings culminated inside me, stirring, festering. I didn't know how long I'd spent staring at both the hatch and the missing wall of my room. I hardly noticed the sun beginning to creep slightly through the underside of the kitchen window. Shaking still, I opened the hatch and descended into the hallway. The same hallway that the creature had crawled across. I stood outside Jake's room and drew a deep breath slowly, twisting the door's lock. With a click, The door opened into a hazy blackness. The blackout curtains left only the light from the hall to illuminate the room, or at least as far as the bed that was positioned, cutting the room in half. Jake's head slowly peered over the near-flat covers, shortly after followed by Ellie's, that snaked itself directly beneath his. Ellie spoke out as if talking to someone who stood just behind me. "Shut the door, will you, dear? You're going to ruin the surprise." Well, I didn't need to be asked twice and slowly clicked the door shut. I spent the morning cleaning the kitchen, quickly and quietly, desperately hoping no one would walk in. I know I'd have to answer some unpleasant questions like what the hell was I playing at, or had I taken some of Jake's medication? Once I was finished, I sat down, exhausted from the work, as Sasha slowly stumbled into the kitchen, wearing Lucas's large baseball tee. She opened the fridge and stared at it for a good few minutes before realizing something was very wrong. In a frustrated yell, Sasha shouted, "Lucas, your stoner brother's eaten everything." I forced a laugh at Sasha and ate a protein bar my mum had packed for me. I began processing what I'd seen last night in detail. The fridge, the mess, the creature, and now Jake and Ellie. Lucas strolled into the kitchen and did his odd sitcom opening. "Well, hello family, how are we this fine morning?" Right after saying this, he kissed my hair and then Sasha before going to prepare some toast, but was unable to find any bread. "Hey Bobby, are Jake and Ellie awake yet?" "Well, I checked a few minutes ago and they were still asleep. You guys call me lazy," I cautiously joked in my reply. Both Jake's and Ellie's voices shouted simultaneously from their room. "Lucas, brother, I need your help with something." Lucas, undisturbed, walked out of the kitchen and into Jake's room. Well, after a few minutes of silence, I began to get panicked. Slowly I walked to the door and felt for the handle. Sasha, intrigued, followed me, staying only a few feet behind. Never did I break eye contact from the door or the space beyond it. The door's lock clicked and slowly swung open. What I and Sasha saw left both our whole bodies frozen. The feelings I felt were identical to how I'd felt the previous night. In front of us stood a slender grey figure with two elk-like antlers protruding from a skull-like cranium and an almost malnourished physique. It was holding Lucas, who stared at me and Sasha. The beast threw Lucas at the wall and then proceeded to face the door. Well, I saw this as a sign to run, but Sasha stood transfixed, like a deer in the headlights. I sprinted out of the cabin and ran towards the van, never looking back or slowing down. I didn't care. As I approached the van, my heart sank. It had been trashed and flipped over. Something about this forced my mind to cast back to that dream I'd had. I gulped and knew I had no other alternative options. Well, I had to return to the cabin. I began walking back slowly, well aware of the numerous eyes that were fixated on me. I ripped a large branch from a tree for defense and continued on the path. I chuckled and smiled as I felt the eyes around me begin to scatter. The feeling gave me a sense of excitement and fear, well, unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I approached the cabin door and gripped the handle tightly. I took a deep breath and opened the door. I sat up in a start and scraped the top of my head against the light. This led to a mysterious onslaught of pain around my coronal suture. I observed the room I was in. It took me a few moments to recognize it as my alcove, of the room in the cabin, still with its open wall and plummeting descent into the kitchen. I staggeringly crawled and scraped my head on the roof. An ungodly scratching noise filled my ears and my head jerked back. took me a few seconds for the pain to crack and creep into my already pounding head. Keeping my head low, I groggily fumbled for the hatch, but with every inch I crept, I heard what sounded like scratching on the roof, and felt the slight jerk. I flipped over and looked at the ceiling. There were 2 light scratches running parallel to where I'd woken up. My mind cast back to what I could remember, entering the cabin, and then a sharp, blunt force that led to darkness consuming me as if I'd been knocked out. For the life of me, I couldn't remember how I'd managed to get back to my room. Perhaps I'd been dragged there. I composed myself and slowly descended the ladder into the hall. As soon as I had both my feet on the floor, an ever so sweet and beautiful aroma filled my nostrils, what I could only describe as roast pork cooked to perfection. I followed the scent to the dining room in the cabin, almost hypnotized by it. The cabin's dining room was now set up to seat 2 people at each end of the table. I looked over the contents that adorned the table. 2 plates and a large roast that was covered by an aluminum sheet. On the plates lay a thick, juicy chunk of meat with bones sticking out of one end. "Please do have a seat, Bobby." A voice spoke that was a combination of Jake's, Ellie's, and now Sasha's. "Who are you? What do you want?" I demanded. "No question, please. We merely want you to sit." I sat in the chair that had been set up for me, but as soon as my hands hit the chair arms, 2 cold and clammy hands grabbed my arms and legs, leaving me defenseless. I pleaded for help from anyone, but I knew there was no one there to hear me. I heard something crawling above my head. "Who are you?" I cried out, but I didn't get a response. Instead, the figure I saw rummaging around the kitchen scaled down the walls from the rafters. Once it had reached the floor, the figure walked around the table until it stood at the side of me, and I could clearly see every bit of detail from its elk skull that seemingly melded into its head with luminous crimson eyes to its bony, grey, decrepit body. My brain couldn't fathom what I was seeing, the monstrosity of a being looming over me. Without even moving its mouth, the creature demanded I eat, and plunged a large chunk of the meat into my mouth. Satisfied with its demands, the creature then did an insanely athletic lunge, similar to a cat, across the table and into the seat on the other side. My arms were then released, and I reluctantly grabbed the chunk of meat by the protruding bone. The smell was so sweet, and the lingering taste of the meat the creature had forced me to eat still remained, and I sank my teeth into it. The creature smiled through its skull, and its crimson eyes turned sapphire. The taste was surprisingly nice, as if it was a combination of every meat I'd grown up loving. I took another bite, and then another, and another. The taste was just so good that I began stripping the meat to the bone. The creature had almost finished eating its own chunk of meat. It then stood up and asked what I'd thought of the meal. I was honest and said that it was one of the tastiest foods I'd ever had in my life. It surpassed any taste I'd ever had before. The creature emoted happiness and lifted the elk skull only for me to see that it was grafted to the back of its head and that its elk horns were growing from its head. With a smile, the creature opened its mouth and its tongue slivered out. On its tongue were the heads of Jake, Ellie, and Sarah. "What the hell?" I said, shocked. "This is the blessing I have received. Now, Bobby, so have you." The heads of Jake, Ellie, and Sasha spoke then. "You are now one with us, Bobby. We are the walkers in the woods. We are the majestic Wendigo." The Wendigo then grabbed a mirror from the wall and forced my head to look into it. And my response was shock. On top of my head was a small set of antlers growing. My skin had turned an unusual ash grey as well. I gasped, but Even that left me afraid. On my tongue lay the sleeping heads of those three, just like they were on the Wendigo's tongue. And now for the main course. Allow me. The Wendigo dragged off the dustcloth from the table. In the center was Lucas, gagged and bound. The arms had released me from the chair, and I scaled the table and crawled to Lucas's side and freed his mouth. Bobby, what the hell's going on? We need to escape. Please, Bobby. I opened my mouth, but what came out were Jake's, Ellie's, and Sasha's voices. And I felt their voices worm their way from the pit of my tongue and say exactly what it was I wanted to say. There's no need to worry. I delved into Lucas's chest and began stripping him of his organs and flesh to consume. Once I was finished, I wiped my mouth and once again looked into the mirror. The Wendigo ate his share of Lucas behind me. Upon my tongue a small boil began to grow behind Sasha's head. It continued to grow until the unmistakable shape of Lucas's head nestled itself comfortably onto my tongue. I smiled, grabbed a large bone shard that I felt protruding from my spine and pulled it over my head before letting out an ungodly howl from the pain. The Wendigo then placed his hand onto my shoulder and led me to the back door. I could see a campfire out in the woods, surrounded by tents. The Wendigo whispered into my ear, "Happy hunting." I grinned and charged from the cabin on all fours to my next meal. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like throwing me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.